Washington State. My name is Eileen Quigley, and I am the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute. Before we get underway, I would want to acknowledge that I am standing on the ancestral and unceded land of the Coast Salish people, which includes the Suquamish, Duwamish, Nisqually, Snoqualmie, and Muckleshoot tribes. I acknowledge and honor their history as well as their past and ongoing stewardship of their land. With me today are Poppy Storm, the founder and director of innovation at the 2050 Institute, Heather Christopher of Ross Strategic, and Ruby Moore Bloom, researcher of the Clean Energy Transition Institute, who will be assisting me today with the Q&A portion of our webinar. Our agenda begins with Heather walking us through the webinar logistics. I will then briefly describe the missions of the Clean Energy Transition Institute and the 2050 Institute, and then Poppy will present the findings of the white paper that she has authored. We will do the best we can to reserve time for Q&A after Poppy has finished her presentation. It is possible that we will not have much time left in the hour for questions, and given that we had nearly 150 people registered today, we will definitely not get through all of the questions that participants raise. We will post written answers to the questions that are collected in the Q&A, as well as a frequently asked questions document after the webinar. This webinar is intended to offer a high-level summary of the white paper, and we anticipate engaging with stakeholders who are on this webinar, as well as those who couldn't make it today, to continue the dialogue about the steps that Washington State must take now to get on the path to decarbonizing its building sector. Heather will now explain how the webinar will function technically.
Great, thanks, Eileen. So all of you joining as attendees will remain in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. This means that you will be muted, but please submit your questions as they come up using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. We've disabled chat so that we can have all of your questions come through Q&A, and as Eileen mentioned, we'll be monitoring that and be submitting responses following the webinar. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online and distributed out to all registrants.
Thank you very much, Heather. The Clean Energy Transition Institute is an independent, nonpartisan research and analysis nonprofit organization whose mission is to accelerate an equitable transition to a clean energy economy in the Northwest. We provide neutral data, analytics, and best practices about decarbonization, which enables fact-based conversations among stakeholders and policymakers about the smartest strategies, actions, and policies to pursue to decrease carbon emissions as swiftly as the climate science tells us we must. Next slide. The 2050 Institute is a building decarbonization research and policy consulting network that partners with utilities, policymakers, and market actors to deliver building efficiency and decarbonization at scale. The Institute uses a whole systems design approach to develop strategies, frameworks, policies, codes, and programs across regional, state, local, community, and utility programs and policies. The Clean Energy Transition Institute and the 2050 Institute developed Operation 2030, Scaling Building Decarbonization in Washington State, to frame and jumpstart the mobilization that is required on multiple levels to fully scale building decarbonization activities by 2030. The project is intended to help chart this path with a specific emphasis on time-critical strategic decisions and actions that must happen in the 2020s. The white paper provides independent analysis of the deep decarbonization pathways modeling that underpins the Washington 2021 State Energy Strategy. Going forward, we aim to provide additional targeted analysis, hold strategic forums, and release policy briefs throughout 2022 that refine the white paper's findings and reflect stakeholder input. We describe the next steps for this effort in section 7, starting on page 29 of the white paper. I will now turn the presentation over to Poppy to present the findings.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. We're really excited to present the findings from this work and get your feedback. So I'm just going to launch into things. We really developed this paper with an intention of trying to get a better sense of the scale and pace that is required to decarbonize the building sector in Washington State by 2050. In the 2021 Washington State Energy Strategy, there is a really large scale and pace indicated. And so we felt there was a need to have more of a bridge between the higher level analysis in the strategy and more of a roadmap for how we operationalize that. In addition, we really wanted to focus on this crucial 10 years in this overall planning horizon. What do we really need to do in the next 10 years leading up to 2030 in order to best position our state for achieving the emissions limits in 2050? So our white paper is organized around 4 key imperatives that we identified, and the presentation today gives some highlights of those imperatives. The first is the need to really understand, internalize, and adapt to the decarbonization and scale that we are challenged with. The second is to commit to the most strategic path for achieving that decarbonization in the building sector. The third is to establish measurable targets that programs and policies and many activities across the building decarbonization ecosystem can start orienting towards so that they can be in better alignment. And the fourth is to scale building decarbonization by 2030. And in a way, much of the white paper is really around why we need to do that and what it looks like to actually scale building decarbonization by 2030. So first, I'm going to talk about adapting to decarbonization scale and pace. So in 2020, the Washington State Legislature passed emissions limits, revised emissions limits, setting us on a trajectory to be carbon neutral by 2050. And this really isn't just a goal, it's a legal requirement. So most of what the state energy strategy was really focused on was how can the state meet those emissions limits? And it's looking at it from an economy-wide perspective. In this graphic here, we're really looking at what the implications of that are in terms of what our historical emissions have been, as well as what our target emissions should be if we are to achieve those emissions limits set forth by the state legislature. So we are in a mode where we have to shift our building sector emissions from historical increases to a dramatic decrease. And the way that this graphic is set up, we have the historical emissions on the left side and target emissions on the right side. And we have had more than a 40% increase in emissions between 1990 and 2019. So this is the previous 30 years, 1990 to more or less 2020. And now we have 30 years from now until 2030, where we have to see a really dramatic decrease in emissions. And the question is, what does it really take to deliver that? All of our current policies and programs and building decarbonization, planning and implementation ecosystem, particularly with efficiency historically being at the heart of that, has delivered a 40% or more increase in our emissions over the past 30 years. So we are looking at needing to have a radical departure really in how we're achieving decarbonization in order to truly bend the curve starting now and leading to 2050. And in addition to that, there are a lot of potentially positive and negative impacts and implications for people in the workforce and in terms of how these benefits are being distributed and whether or not they're being distributed equitably as we move forward in this transition. And so what we really wanted to do with this paper was to get a much clearer understanding of what the actual technical and market mechanisms really need to be in order to achieve this transition, so that many groups and organizations and communities and policymakers and other decision makers can start taking those technical and market transformation mechanisms into account in trying to plan for this transition on many levels. So just a little bit more detail on why we've seen those historical emissions increases. This slide has two key graphics, one on the left, figure 4 from our white paper, graphs residential sector emissions by fuel type. And on the right, we have figure 5, which is commercial sector emissions by fuel type. And what we see is that the blue line on each is the electricity increases, and the orange red line represents the gas emissions increases. So our electricity increases have a much slower slope, and they appear to align more directly with population increases on both in the building stock, on both the residential and the commercial side. Where we see a big departure is on the gas emissions. And on the residential side in particular, it's fairly pronounced. We're seeing a 230% increase in emissions on the natural gas side between 1990 and 2019. And on the commercial side, we see an increase, but it's not quite as steep. We're seeing about a 66% increase on the commercial side. So moving forward to bend the curve, if you will, quite steeply, and to shift this trend of increasing emissions, we really need to have significant and major market shifts by 2030. And this is a really key finding from our work, and it's why most of the paper is really focused on this 10 years leading up to 2030. And based on our analysis of the state energy strategy, deep decarbonization modeling results, we're really looking at, one, needing to have a 96% reduction in carbon in the building sector by 2050. So that represents the transition of the actual building stock. What needs to happen by 2030 is a transition of the market, because if the market doesn't actually transition by 2030, we really won't be able to catch up on the millions of replacements that need to happen over the full planning horizon leading up to 2050. So this further emphasizes the importance of this 10 years leading up to 2030, so that we can start thinking about how do we structure the policy development, the timing of that development, and our capacity building, so that we really truly are prepared by 2030 to hit the rate necessary in terms of both new construction and retrofits to have zero net carbon buildings in transition through 2050. So briefly, before we move on from this slide, shifting the market really is about ensuring that we have that policy framework and that we also have the market capacity to deliver on the zero net carbon new construction and retrofits that are required at scale in order to ultimately move through our full building stock by 2050. The next key imperative is committing to the most strategic path for decarbonizing buildings. And Washington's strategic building to decarbonization pathway was really fairly clearly defined in the state energy strategy. This is the most comprehensive decarbonization modeling and planning that has ever been done in Washington state. And it's currently integral to the state's strategy for how they decarbonize. And one of the elements that's integral to that strategic building decarbonization pathway is the electrification of space and water heating equipment. And there are a number of reasons for that that I will highlight in this presentation, but that we explore in much more depth in the paper. So before I do an overview of what some of these key reasons are for why electrification is the most strategic and lowest cost path, I just want to quickly highlight some aspects of the modeling that will help kind of frame the sensitivities that were looked at in that deep decarbonization assessment. So the main difference between the scenario where we have electrification of building end uses, key building end uses, and retaining gas in buildings is really just that we have a high number of gas equipment being replaced with high efficiency, and in some cases, regular efficiency electric equipment. On the gas and building side, we have also a high number of retrofits, but instead of converting those gas appliances to high efficiency electric, a high percentage of them, but not all of them, but a high percentage are converted to higher efficiency gas appliances. So there's a major retrofit effort on both sides, but the main difference is that on the gas and building side, we retain a much larger volume of pipeline gas in the energy system, and that also requires that a much larger volume of pipeline gas be decarbonized, and that has implications for costs and overall energy use. So those are the two scenarios that we're looking at, but they really are inclusive of certain dials that help us understand how we can make adjustments in what this decarbonization pathway looks like. So quickly, before I go on to the details of these, the first key reason why electrification is the strategic building decarbonization pathway is that on-site fossil fuel use emits nearly 100% of the building emissions by 2030. So that really is the central objective of building decarbonization starting in 2030, is to remove those fossil fuel emissions. The second is that electrification deepens energy savings, and it also accelerates emissions reductions. So deepening energy savings is part of what is lowering costs overall at a society and economy wide level, and also for individual consumers. The third is the equipment rollover dynamics that are really driving the scale and pace of the transition. So we can see that if we don't start that electrification as early as possible, we really are going to have to potentially do more early replacements and drive up costs later in our trajectory for accomplishing decarbonization. The fourth is that the electrification approach saves a cumulative total of 34 billion by 2050 over the gas in buildings scenario. And that is incremental, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in a subsequent slide. And the fourth, which is also very important, is that energy efficiency is critical to offsetting load growth. And we see a really high level of energy efficiency on both the electrification and the gas in buildings scenarios. So this is really includes a lot of different decisions that can be made about the efficiency of buildings, about bringing in demand response, even solar and other options that can be used to further modulate the impact of building electrification. So I just want to hit on a few key points on all of those bullets, starting with the ratio of fossil fuel use and emissions. So we have the Clean Energy Transition Act, which is requiring by 2030 carbon neutral electricity. And so this is a key assumption in the state energy strategy, and we're following that assumption through into our analysis of those results and our proposal for targets. So as you can see in this graphic, this is total building sector emissions in the electrification scenario from 2020 out to 2050. And the blue on the top is the electricity, and the orange and yellow and other parts of the bars are mostly fossil fuel use, natural gas and liquid fuels. So what you can see is that in 2020 leading up to 2025 and on the way to 2030, we have a portion up to about 50% of our emissions coming from electricity. And this is why CETA, the Clean Energy Transition Act, is such an important strategy for building decarbonization. And that is because by 2030, once that part of the energy use is decarbonized, we dramatically reduce our emissions in buildings. And what we're left with is really the natural gas and liquid fuels. So this is really the central objective of building decarbonization, is removing those fossil fuel emissions. The next key point is that electrification deepens energy savings and accelerates emissions reductions. So these graphics are total energy. So this is all fuels combined, electricity, gas, everything, which is an important metric, and also important to look at as a distinct metric from just electric or gas, for example. So on the left side, we are looking at the total building sector energy reductions for 3 scenarios. And on the right side, we're looking at total building sector emissions reductions. So what we see in the energy reductions is that with the 3 scenarios, which we have the electrification, the gas in buildings, and also a reference scenario, we see that the electrification scenario is delivering the lowest overall energy use by 2050. And it's significantly less energy use than the reference, but also significantly less energy use than the gas and building scenario. So the electrification scenario in its entirety is a massive energy efficiency strategy because we are dramatically reducing overall energy use. On the emission side, we see that there is a similar trajectory for all 3 scenarios leading up to 2030, and that's mainly because of the impact of CETA that I described in the previous slide. But then starting in 2030, you start to see a departure, and the electrification path really starts to break away and dip down on a much steeper slope. And that difference between the orange line of the trajectory for gas and buildings and the blue electrification really has major cost implications and in terms of savings, and then also in terms of emissions and how quickly we can actually achieve those emissions and the relationship between that and our overall economy-wide targets. So this is also an example of where the electrification scenario really adds value to our overall effort to decarbonize the economy. The next slide is looking at the equipment rollover dynamics and how they're really influencing how we need to think about the scale and pace of this transition. So there's a lot more discussion about this in the paper, but I just really wanted to quickly hit on a few things. The dark blue is electric high efficiency appliances, the light blue is electric, and the orange is fossil fuels. So what we see for residential space heating here on the left is that, one, we're starting out with a high level in 2020 of sales of electric appliances. A combination of electric and electric high efficiency is already more than 60%. So it's really this top part of the bars, which is the gas equipment, that is slowly winding down in terms of the sales shares. And by 2030, we have electric total hitting almost 80% and then exceeding 80% by 2035. This is how it was modeled in the state energy strategy. We certainly could be looking at, and will be looking at more in the future, how we might be able to turn some of these dials. Can we have an increased sales share? What are the impacts on costs and overall value to the grid on increasing that? So that's the residential space heating side. And then on residential water heating, you see by 2035, it's almost going to 100% of sales. So the way to interpret this really is that once you're hitting near 100% of sales shares, which applies to both new and installs of equipment in new buildings as well as replacement, that is a key metric for the transition of the market, because our policies and programs and incentives and market transformation efforts have shifted the market so that all of those individual decisions on equipment purchases are in the zero emission equipment camp. So that is important for thinking about how we set our targets and how we structure our policies and programs. And you'll see when we present our proposed targets that although we aren't going to 100% in the decarbonization modeling for the state energy strategy by 2030, we're starting to really get close by 2035. And so we are proposing that we, from a policy perspective, we really push for taking it to scale by 2030, so that by 2035, we are really fully on our way to meeting our 2050 emissions reduction targets. So electrification is saving $34 billion by 2050 in cumulative incremental costs above the, in terms of the electrification scenario versus the gas and buildings scenario. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that in the gas and buildings scenario, we don't see the large reduction in overall energy use. So that is increasing costs. We also see that there's a much higher volume of pipeline gas still remaining in the system at 2050. We have about 18 trillion BTU in the electrification scenario, but it's about 117 trillion in the gas and building scenario. And a very large percentage of that total pipeline gas needs to be decarbonized, and that is a very expensive strategy. And finally, energy efficiency is really critical to offsetting load growth. Again, this is discussed in more detail in the paper, but I just wanted to point out for everyone here that the residential electricity demand across all three scenarios in the state energy strategy modeling is projected to decrease. So this is in the electrification scenario is the blue line. We're seeing a decrease in electricity use in the residential sector from 2020 to 2050. And we also see a decrease in the reference case and in the gas and buildings case. So we're not really increasing electricity demand on the residential side in spite of the electrification. And a lot of that on the residential side has to do with the high volumes of electric resistance equipment that needs to be, that would be transitioned in all of these scenarios, well, both of the scenarios, electrification and gas and buildings, would be transitioned to higher efficiency electric systems, which is a very large amount of electric savings. On the commercial side, we are seeing an increase in all three scenarios, the electrification, the gas and buildings, and the reference scenario. And a lot of this is really being driven by the population forecasts. So the electricity is serving new buildings that are coming in over the forecast time period. I would also note that there are some assumptions in the state energy strategy modeling for commercial buildings that likely could be explored in future analysis. For example, the volume of gas to electric rather than gas to high efficiency electric conversions. So there is likely an opportunity for a lot more efficiency on the commercial side and the opportunity to potentially bend this down as well. So that really is all I wanted to cover in the modeling itself. I think it's very instructive to have a better understanding of really the technical underpinnings so that we can understand how we might translate those findings of that decarbonization path into targets that we can use to really drive this shift. So now I'd like to talk about the targets. So we really looked at these replacement trajectory and the sales shares that are really required to hit the limits. And we use that to develop a table of targets. And I am going to hit on some of the key elements of this and really emphasize the role of hitting the 2030 targets. So we have these targets projected out at 5-year intervals for planning purposes for policies and programs. And on the left-hand side, we have the targets, which cover emissions reduction targets, as well as targets for new construction and existing building retrofits, and we're covering both commercial and residential. So I am just going to quickly provide some kind of exploration of what this is looking like, because it is definitely a helpful index. The first one is building sector emissions reductions. By 2030, we need to have a 60% reduction in emissions, and then that goes down incrementally through 2050. For commercial new construction, we need to have zero net carbon new construction ratio of about 75% by 2030. We have that set at 100% for residential new construction, and really what's driving this is just the time frames for development after a code is adopted. So this would imply the 75% for commercial new construction implies actually getting zero emission codes approved much earlier than 2030, so that we are delivering new construction at a high ratio by 2030. By 2030, we need to have about 1.8% of the commercial floor area receiving zero net carbon retrofits. And that's a combination of deeper retrofits coupled with replacements with zero emission, high efficiency electric equipment, as well as just retrofits of equipment. And that equates to about 38 million square feet a year. On the residential side, by 2030, we need to retrofit 3.1% of the building stock, and that equates to about 110,000 residential units per year. So that is really an important thing to emphasize here. This isn't a total of these amounts by these years. This is the milestone that we have to hit in terms of the rates per year. So every single year, starting in 2030, we need to be retrofitting 110,000 residential units. And we need to sustain that rate through 2050. So all of this is really culminating in the need to scale building decarbonization by 2030. And defining what that means to scale by 2030 is really also critical and essential, and it's a lot of what the paper is really focused on. And just to recap, building sector emissions need to be 60% less than 2020. New and replacement space and water heating equipment must be producing zero emissions. So this is near 100% market transformation by 2030, and we have just under 10 years to do that. And we also need to ensure that the transformation is really well designed and managed and strategic and tracked to support equitable outcomes. And the market needs to be capable of really delivering on this decarbonization. So there is a lot to do by a lot of different entities across the building decarbonization ecosystem, but this is really a summation of what that means to scale by 2030. I have two concluding slides that really are an overview of what we explore in more detail in the paper. We describe some of the key strategies for accomplishing that scaling up of building decarbonization. And it really includes some more systemic change where we're having better alignment at the regional planning level that has such a deep influence on how utilities are operating. We also need to have our building decarbonization plans to help have a more detailed roadmap for building decarbonization. We need to have our targets set up. We need to structure our codes and policies to scale zero net carbon buildings by 2030. We need to recalibrate our incentive structures, and we also need to operationalize large scale implementation. And what our paper really is culminating in is how does this all work out in terms of the key phases that this really needs to happen in leading up particularly to 2030. So this is really a summation of what we have been working on with the paper. And I will just go over some of the key highlights. The first is phase 1, which is 2022 to 2025. And that is where we really need to build up the policy and planning platform. So this building decarbonization transition really isn't about passing policies over the next 30 years. These policies really need to be in place by 2025 so that they can be activated and go through rulemaking and actually come into effect by 2030 to help support reaching that scale. So in that first phase, we're completing our decarbonization plans. We're establishing a targets and tracking framework to manage and track and evaluate that transition, trying to align a lot of policies and planning, and as I mentioned, passing all key policies. Then in 2026 to 2030, we're looking at more of a decarbonization ramp up. Not that we aren't decarbonizing across this whole time period, but this is really where we're ramping up. When we have our policies in place, we're activating those policies, we're scaling the market capacity and productivity, and ultimately scaling our capacity to do zero net carbon, new and existing buildings at the scale required to meet the 2050 limits. And then phase 3 is really at scale decarbonization. And that is 2031 to 2050. At that point, everything should really be in place to be able to steadily retrofit our buildings through 2050. And that will require that we are conducting ongoing support for supply chain effectiveness. This is not a 100-year, 150-year market transformation effort. This is only a 30-year effort. So we need to really be ensuring that the market has what it needs to really implement on this. And then ultimately, we're reducing building emissions by 96% by 2050. So and across all of this, there's a really major component of workforce and community investment required to ensure equitable outcomes. With that, I am going to hand things back over to Eileen to discuss next steps and hold the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Poppy. As I mentioned earlier, we're eager to explore the white paper's findings with stakeholders to determine how to put in place the strategies that Poppy just discussed from now until 2030 and 25 and then to 2030. The building sector transformation that is needed to attain Washington's emission reduction targets is significant and requires engagement from all local, state, and regional stakeholders and policymakers. Next slide, please. The white paper, a key findings document, and the building sector data that were analyzed in the paper can all be found on the Clean Energy Transition website, cleanenergytransition.org. And on the first link under the projects tab drop-down menu, we will also be posting this presentation, the webinar recording, and we will send a follow-up email with links to all materials to everyone who participated today and to both of our organizations' full email lists. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And so, Poppy, I'm going to start with some clarifying questions that were asked along the way. In slide 10, in your figure 4, it had looked like the lines were pretty flat until the one data point of 2019. what happened between 2015 and 2019 to drive the increase? So you might want to go back to slide 10.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. It looks like in figure 4, the lines are pretty flat until the one data point in 2019. What happened between 2015 and 2019 to drive the increase?
Yeah, this is based on Energy Information Agency data, and we're plotting that data directly. It wasn't part of the analysis that we were doing to determine what was driving these changes. But I assume that it is a change potentially in the population of the building stock, or other types of changes that are happening over time in the building stock.
And that was from Tim Miller. Thank you, Tim. Tim and others also would like you to explain how it's possible for the gas in building scenario to get so close to zero by 2050 as it was just depicted. This came from a couple of people, and it sounds like the answer to the question is that the scenario assumes we're using decarbonized gas in 2050. And is that true?
Yes, that's exactly right. The way that the modeling was done for the state energy strategy, it was looking at how each of these scenarios could meet that endpoint. So they were really all optimized to determine what the technical strategies would be to ensure that those scenarios would actually meet the emissions limits. And so in the gas and buildings scenario, although there is about 118 trillion BTU of pipeline gas remaining in the system, more than 90 of those are decarbonized. So once you decarbonize, a large ratio of that decarbonized gas, you are drawing those emissions down, especially after you've implemented so much efficiency on all sides to actually draw down the energy use. But what we see on the electrification side is that there still is pipeline gas at the end, but it's about 18 trillion TBTU, and only about half of that is decarbonized. So you're looking at the difference between decarbonizing about 8 trillion TBTU and decarbonizing more than 90 trillion TBTU on the gas and building side.
Okay, on around slide 18 and slide 20, Keith Irvin asked at slide 18, does the projection of falling residential electricity demand adequately account for home charging of a greatly growing number of electric vehicles?
Unfortunately, that is not something that I know at that level of detail for the decarbonization modeling, but we could certainly look into that and try to communicate what those assumptions were in that original work. And I think it is certainly something that should be considered more in the future.
Yes. Cord Olson asked, ever tightening building codes will continue to reduce energy consumption on the commercial side. So why do you project such significant rise in commercial building energy usage?
This really has to do with the increase in the populations of the building. So there's these projections assume that there's going to be about a 30% increase in floor area. So there's a significant amount of additional energy that's associated with that increase. And in addition, there is, as I mentioned, there are additional opportunities for increasing the efficiency and how this is modeled. And so I think that that should be explored more in the future, and to potentially have it be more informed by what the potential is on the code side.
Rusty Williams has asked several questions that I've seen. I have to go back to the chat to see what else has come in. One was, did you look at if residential had used electricity instead of natural gas from 1990 to the present? And would the electric utilities have been better or worse emissions? So that was in the past. And then he also asked, is energy line loss considered in the energy reductions?
So we weren't analyzing the historical emissions. We mainly were trying to see what they were and understand them in relation to what is projected. I think that that is would be very interesting analysis and could be very informative even in looking forward, but it wasn't part of the analysis that we were doing.
Let's see. Okay, Holly Towns had a series of questions. She was asking, how does this work integrate with the Department of Commerce required study on decarbonizing buildings that was funded in the last legislative session? Essentially, what is left to figure out?
Okay, let me just start with that. I think that this is really complementary with that work, and in fact, it's really kind of a bridge between the state energy strategy and that more detailed work. So this is really trying to explore the findings in the state energy strategy and produce an example of what these types of targets could look like. And one of the key recommendations in the paper is really to have those building decarbonization plans for residential and commercial, and when they need to happen, and what are some of the components that really should be in them. So that's already somewhat in motion at the state level with on the residential side. And this is, I think, really just complementary to that, but what we're doing is not at the level of detail that those plans should be. And we're also recommending that those plans be somewhat of a prototype for how decarbonization planning is performed in Washington, and that it should potentially inform how utilities do their conservation potential assessments. So it's complementary and in that sense.
There are many questions that I can see that we are not going to be able to get to. And there are questions that are asking us about policies, whether we make policy recommendations in the white paper, and some specific policies that are already either passed or being considered. So we will definitely have to write up much more detailed responses. Poppy, do you have any sort of high level on policies and how you treated policies in the paper?
Yeah, I would just say that these 5 strategies that we have on slide 23 are the way that our scaling building decarbonization by 2030 section is organized. And for each of these, we list a number of policy and policy related recommendations. We're not specifically recommending bills or referring to bills at that level. It's more, what are the types of policy changes that deliver on the types of market and technical shifts that we're laying out in Operation 2030. So that's really how it's structured, but there is more specificity in the paper.
There's a question about electrification and high efficiency electrification equipment. So is there an equivalent high efficiency gas technology that could be modeled, or is this the decarbonized gas that you've referenced?
On the gas and building side, it isn't just that the gas is being decarbonized, it's that it also implies a similar level of retrofits as electrification. But instead of upgrading from gas to high efficiency electric, it's upgrading to modern higher efficiency gas appliances. So there's a major retrofit component to the gas and building side as well. However, those equipment efficiencies are less than 100%, whereas the high efficiency electric are more in the neighborhood of 200 to 300% efficiency.
Johnny Kocher has asked, do you feel that the current heat pump proposals being considered by the Washington State Building Codes Council are aligned with what is recommended in this white paper?
Like I mentioned, we don't really go into specific policies. We do discuss the codes, but we don't go into it at that level. But there is some alignment in the way that we're structuring the recommendations for how and when the zero emission requirements are integrated into the code. And one of the recommendations is to start as early as possible so that we have time to bring it in more fully into the code by later in the 2020s.
Okay, let me try and see. Can you briefly explain the reason why market penetration rates of heat pumps versus heat pump water heaters are quite different?
I think that is, most of those graphics really were taken directly from the state energy strategy modeling. So there were some certain assumptions in where the dials were set, and part of it has to do with just the optimization of trying to hit the final emissions limits and what was required. What is actually really useful to keep in mind is that moving forward, we can really think about where we actually set those dials and how much more efficiency we may want to get across various end uses. So we shouldn't see those as totally static, but that's a summary of what the assumptions were in the state energy strategy. And actually, one more thing I would add, it also aligns to some degree with replacement rates. So there are different measure lives for those equipment, and that has to be taken in consideration as well. As long as you're aligning with those natural rates, there's only so fast that you can go.
I think what I would add too is that the Clean Energy Transition Institute is hoping to rerun the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Pathways modeling this year with updated assumptions, and be able to look at some of specifically these types of assumptions in greater detail to inform what has to happen between now and 2030. Because the focus of that work and the work that was done for the state energy strategy was a 2050 target, and we need to see if we can dig in more deeply to understand the types of issues that are raised here. So we're at the top of the hour. As I said, we will provide written responses to all of the questions. We'll group them if they can be grouped, and then we will put out the written responses with the recording and with the webinar slides. Poppy, if you want to advance to the last slide with our email addresses. So on behalf of the Clean Energy Transition Institute and the 2050 Institute, I thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to continuing a dialogue with those who are interested about the findings we presented today. Both of our emails are here. Please do not hesitate to contact us to continue the dialogue we started this morning, and please download the white paper. So with that, I believe we are closed, and I thank you very much. I apologize for not being able to get to all of the Q&A, but we will definitely answer them in writing.